This video is sponsored by Venom Twin Docking Station for Xbox. Supporting every generation of Xbox One right up to the Series X, easy to use and quick to charge. This is the next best thing to getting solar powered consoles, and they don't exist, I know. I've tried. Until then, grab one in the link below and never run out of juice.
Any appeal for backup is going to fall on very deaf ears. Good luck, gentlemen.
You know what they say, better late than never, hey? As you may or may not know, this YouTube gig is a part-time thing for me. I do this on my own, on the side. It's a side project in addition to my full-time and stressful software and hardware delivery role, being a family man and only being supported by the kind guys and girls over on Patreon with a few dollars and pounds a month I get from the ever-shrinking YouTube revenue. Obviously, as you also know, I work with IGN now, so that's an addition to this. It's not the same as this. And as such, I've always had this juggling act on what to cover. It greatly limits my scope and focus, but I do start projects and then never finish them, so I've decided to create a new sort of section that is a pickup, one I started a few years ago, Lost in the Crowd. Now, this is all around ones that I might have missed due to the above time constraints, never getting review code, which is sadly 95% of the time, or maybe just a very low impact title that I've started but never finished. Here I can wrap them up with a late but more detailed look where possible to compensate for the tardiness. So what better way to relax than with some well executed executions, James Bond style. With a brief history of the Hitman origins and its impact before digging into some console head-to-heads. I'm sure absolutely nothing will go wrong with that. The team behind Hitman, Danish IO Interactive, woke up their human clone of Bond back in 2000. Even the Morris Binder intro animation shows the clear inspiration the famous 007 was to 47. Or is that infamous? It was a very different world then, and PC gaming was blossoming. As such, this was a PC exclusive and still is, but it also made great use of the emerging 3D accelerator market. It required a TNL capable accelerator to run with a whopping 32 megabytes of VRAM alongside 128 or even 256 megabytes of system RAM. If you had shifted to that memory munching Windows XP, it's still the best Windows ever. But CPU was also high, a Pentium 3 800MHz or Athlon or Duron of similar speeds, a meaty rig for the time, do not mistake. But it ran vertex lighting with a decent level of light sources, high quality textures and large areas to plan your execution. As this was still a time where demos existed on PC, it was one that I'm sure many remember downloading and then trying to run it. I actually used the demo a great deal at the time, alongside Call of Duty, to test my PC builds and benchmark, a side job I did through the 90s and early 2000s, before laptops and tablets significantly impacted the market. The biggest leap the in-house Glacier engine delivered though was being an early pioneer to incorporate ragdoll physics on rigid bodies, a key element on the death falls of enemies and when dragging them away to hide, merging rigid vertex elements joined by pivot points to make a full articulated body. It was a bit of a groundbreaker. With the advent of much more modern and powerful CPUs though, it can run a little too fast with some comical results. These physics simulations also ran on cloth, plants, trees, including collision and friction, making it a prominent title, showcasing a greater interaction within the world. Physically based movement and animation was also a huge leap up at the time and helped the game gain some impact and sales. Forward and inverse kinematics were used on motility to ground characters in the game and enable more natural climbing, walking or running. This Kowloon interpreter mission really resonates with me, as it was one that I played to death from the demo. The sandbox nature of the game made it even more fun due to the fact that each mission could be different due to the systemic and unique events that could play out across multiple attempts, something made possible by the improved AI and independency of characters, which is equally true today. Roll on 7 further main iterations of the title, and 21 years into the present, we come to the final chapter in the World of Assassination series. During the forgotten years, we have seen 4 PlayStations, Xbox and Nintendo generations slip past, but how much has changed in those 2 decades? First things first, graphical fidelity, quality and detail has obviously leapt forward, and moving from a hexagonal head and vertex based lighting, well mostly, now we see much more detailed animated and polygonally constructed targets throughout. Resolution can now target 4K. In addition, 60 FPS is now a core target on consoles, with 30 being the most likely rate back then on PC. Aside that, the Glacier engine remains true and has lasted the journey from that PC exclusive way back when to this full multi-platform release we see here. In this case, a potential of 11 direct formats received more assassination action, sizable boosts over the one that they had to deliver it on back then. Gameplay and purpose and construction remain largely unchanged, but obviously refined and expanded. Murder is still core, levels are laid out like a puzzle, and you still approach each like a game of chess. Just a fatal one for all involved. But the game has been around long enough for you to know what it entails, so how do they all stack up? Visually, it's still a good looking title. It uses great materials, lighting, bloom, reflectance here with that noisy stochastic drop off on the material sections on the ground, and overall it's always been a good looking game from the team. This Shanghai level is a standout, but from the last generation to the next the difference is minimal. There are some tweaks in those two modes you have on the Pro and the Xbox One X. So you can see here that stochastic noise map that's added onto the screen space reflections is there on quality, and it's reduced on performance. You can see how it looks a bit distorted, and you go to the Series S and that is not present. It's the same settings as performance mode on the Pro and the Xbox One X. And that means that you get a big difference between certain reflections and visual quality in the title between the Series S and the Series X. And that comes down a lot of it to resolution, which I'll get to in a moment. There's a drastic shift between them. But outside of this, reflections in the title use planar reflections or render to texture. There's no ray tracing here, and these run at higher resolutions on the PS5 and the Series X to every other version. This is not ray tracing. You can see here it's running at certain points in the title where it reflects from another viewport camera everything in the scene. Here's just a standard projected cube map, but it cuts back the objects to it's very expensive because you're rendering the game world twice. As you can see examples here on the Xbox One X in quality mode, those shadows are basically blocks from, it looks like Pong, Atari VCS kind of stuff there, and that essentially gives you that view where the shadow map on the right and on the left are drastically different. They're all reduced, just like the resolution. The shadow maps no longer animate, they're a much lower quality, there's no volumetrics, they cut back on the textures and the filtering, the draw calls are cut back, everything is sacrificed to draw this additional viewport. And then here you can see on the Series X and the PS5, visually they're pretty much identical. There's a subtle difference in the resolution of the shadow maps there, but the filtering and everything else is exactly the same. Then that stark drop off to the Series S, and you can see it's lower than the PS4 Pro in quality mode, which is lower slightly than the Xbox One X in quality mode, and it's still low in the performance mode on the PS4 Pro. So overall the shadow maps and the quality in the title are the biggest differences. You can see some of the old sacrifices as well. Look at the eyeballs through his head there, Agent 47. You can see him disappearing and then reappearing, and that's because backface culling on the back of his head. So it's culling the backside of his head with a shadow map, therefore his eyes are being projected through. So I like all these old school techniques, and again this all comes down to it's a very old engine, therefore they've tried to improve it as much as they can on the next generation. Loading is obviously much better on the new generation of consoles. PS5 is marginally faster than the Series X and the Series S, but there's not a lot in it, but it does make a sizable difference, almost 100% faster than it is on the PS4 Pro with an SSD. And obviously the Xbox One X comes in behind, but that can't be updated internally, so you're better off running it on an external USB and then plugging that in with an SSD, and it can actually be faster than the internal drive. So we move over to performance, and that means that we've got the Xbox Series X, Series S and the PS5 all target 60 FPS. They do not have any options to change in the mode. There's no quality and performance for these two consoles, or three consoles, and they all run different resolutions. So the Xbox Series X is the highest with a native 4K 3840 by 2160. Then it's the PS5 on the right, which comes in at 3200 by 1800, and then the Xbox Series S is right down at 1920 by 1080. But it still is a cracking looking game, and it visually looks very close to the rest, but it obviously is a lot softer and not as clean as the other versions. And those reductions in resolution, everything in the game in the buffers, the shadow maps, they're all linear. So that's why you get slightly lower quality shadow maps on the PS5 and again on the Pro between the Xbox One X, and obviously much lower on the Series S because they're all lower down the food chain. But overall performance in these three consoles is pretty much a locked 60. So playing it more like John Rambo than James Bond, it obviously doesn't dip on all these versions, aside one level, which can have some significant sacrifices, and that's the Mendoza level. Now, it's a heavy alpha drawn element, it's outdoors, it's got lots of view and geometry, and the way that they draw core objects in this title does appear to be very linear in terms of they can even have like steps that draw in one by one, as you can see in an example on screen. So pushing this on the Xbox Series X, I could get it to dip into the 40s consistently in one section with the overdraw and the alpha effects running through these little grass and area of foliage, and that happens on the other side of the map as well. But this is the only section I could get it, so therefore it's a good stress test to see just how the engine buckles under all these different hardware permutations. And we can see here that on the Xbox consoles it also uses an adaptive VSync, which it doesn't use on the PlayStation. That's fully VSynced. It's very minor, but around 1 millisecond is added to the frame time. You can see as I zoom in, just as that tear at the top section. Now this can sometimes hold the frame, as you saw there, when the tear draws back in, and sometimes it can tear and then continue and then catch itself back up. And this 1 millisecond is around 6-7% additional frame time that they're giving the Xbox consoles, and it helps, and it certainly tears significantly in the performance mode on the Xbox One X. Tears more than it does in the non-performance mode, funnily enough, but it's trying to stick to that 30 or 60 FPS more often. And on the Xbox Series X here, you can see it's dipping regularly into those 50s, and then in certain stress points, certainly blowing up the watermelons. That was a one stress point I found on all of them. It can actually cause it to dip. And it's geometry bound, it's alpha bound, it's fill rate limited. That's what's happening here. Remember, the Xbox Series X has a much higher resolution than the PlayStation 5, even around 30% delta. And in my opinion, a little bit too much, because the performance delta here is quite significant at certain points. But overall, outside of this level, it doesn't need it. So it's the right choice because it could have hit it. I would have argued the PlayStation 5 probably could have come close. But if it was running 4K, then these sections would be far worse on the PlayStation 5. And as you can see, they're pretty much a locked 60 FPS. I really had to push it hard to get any dips at all, and you're talking a couple of 33 millisecond spikes. That's as much as I could get. Lowest point, again, shooting those watermelons with that, geometry, fill rate limited. It then swamps the screen for a few seconds, but that's still around 15 to almost 18% delta between the two in terms of performance, and that pretty much brings you back to that difference in resolution. So again, it's the right choice. You would not tell the difference between 4K and 1800p 99.9% of the time, even if you're running them side by side, sitting next to it on the same screen. It's very, very hard to spot. And I keep saying this, and I'll keep saying this over and over again. Resolution is a waste of resources. It's much better to use that power to do other things, and performance is more important than a few more pixels on screen. And graphical fidelity, interaction, and all those other elements make that biggest difference here. So arguably the PlayStation 5 is the best one of the lot, but let's be clear, this is one exception across the whole title. So the Xbox One X and the Xbox Series X, performs perfectly 99.9% of the time, unless you go mad and become John Rambo in the weeds. Wrapping up the big boys and moving to the little one in the Series S. It's 4 times lower resolution, and it's in between the performance of the two consoles, so somewhere between the PS5 and the Series X. Again, this is the only section that has issues, but it uses the same adaptive VSync, therefore it can tear occasionally at the top section, and it gives that little bit of delta that it can push through. But overall, it's still a cracking performing title, but it does look the worst of the lot. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but the Series S is the least recommended version I'm testing here. I can't recommend it above any other version just because it just doesn't have anywhere near the level of feeling like a next generation console. In fact, you'd say that this wasn't the next generation console, and the Xbox One X and the Pro is. So crazy as it may seem. But again, the performance here does highlight one area that the S is going to struggle with, and that's memory bandwidth and allocation. All of these and the overall throughput of the GPU, it's going to struggle later in the generation for cross-platform older engines that use ray tracing and they shoehorn them in. You're going to see limitations like this. Generally multi-platform engines like Unreal Engine have a level of overhead that's higher than a dedicated first-party engine designed around the hardware and API construction. And the S really shows that. You know, this is a title that stands out as one that just doesn't feel like a next generation title on the S. And that's really compounded by the fact that the Xbox One X in performance mode runs a 77% higher resolution, 1440p versus 1080p. And that's visible, you can see that. And again, like I say, you've got additional visual effects on top of that, which you probably wouldn't notice, but the image quality you can. 1080 to 1440 is noticeable, 1440 to 1800p is arguably not noticeable, and 1800p to 4K is almost non-existent. So the Xbox One X in performance mode is the one that I would choose day in, day out if you don't have a next generation console, because aside this Mendoza level, it pretty much holds that 60 FPS. You get the best compromise between image quality and performance. It can obviously dip here lower than it does on the other consoles, and certainly lower than the S, but not by a great margin, and you generally wouldn't notice it outside of this kind of in-depth analysis. So the Xbox One X in performance mode is cracking, and it really looks quite good in terms of the sacrifice between those two resolution modes. But if resolution is your main focus, then obviously you can go to that quality mode, and that quality mode bumps that back up to 1800p, the same resolution as the PS5, and therefore you get pretty much identical image quality and output as you would on the next generation consoles. In fact, I'd say if you stuck these side by side with anybody, they'd struggle to tell you which one was which. And that really sums up the title. It's got some, obviously slightly better texture quality on next generation consoles, and that's missing on the Series S as well, and it's like missing on the Pro and the Xbox One X, but you don't really notice it because it's not a significant leap in image quality. And overall, the Xbox One X is the one that I would recommend over any other version, and if you do have it, play the performance mode, because that small sacrifice to resolution is not worth the hit to performance. And then last but certainly not least is the Pro. Again, it has two modes, just like the Xbox One X, quality and performance. You can cap it in the menu option as well to 30 or 60. And that means that quality mode runs at a 2560 by 1440p output, and it looks sharp, it looks clean. And again, not a massive delta between that and the next generation best quality versions, and that includes PC. But obviously the performance takes an impact at this level, and even on the quieter sections it performs worse than the Xbox One X, but run them side by side in the performance and quality mode and the stress sections, it can hold pretty much a lock 60 on the performance mode, and that means it drops to 1080p, but the Pro is generally at 30s to 40s in that quality mode at 1440p. That's 77% boost to a resolution takes an impact because of bandwidth and fill rate, and therefore the performance level means that I wouldn't recommend it, because generally you're going to have dips throughout gameplay even in the quieter sections, where the performance mode performs arguably just as good as the Series S version, with slightly better image quality due to those better shadows, and some of the reflections are slightly better as well. But it's not, like I say, a massive delta. But again, it highlights the fact that a PS4 Pro can run an older engine as well as a next generation Xbox Series S. So I will be interested to see what happens with it throughout this generation, just where the S is going to struggle. But I do suspect we will see a good portion of stressful engine multi-platform titles dropping the resolution on the S to sub 1080p. Because obviously the Pro will die out, the Xbox One X will die out, but the S won't. That's got to last the generation at this point, so it's going to have a bigger stressful point. And that really finishes the video up. And in categorizing them all in order, if you have a choice, the ideal, which one would you play if you have every console sitting in front of you? So the Xbox Series X would be my number one choice, closely followed by the PlayStation 5. And then it would be the Xbox One X, then it would be the Pro, and then it would be the Series S. And then from then on in, it would be the PS4 and the Xbox One S if you have to use it. There's not a massive difference, as I've just covered. And again, it kind of highlights even way back when. This is the same Glacier engine that kicked off IO Interactive, the independent company that's now back being independent, and ironically now finally making the game they wanted to in that James Bond title, the 007 project coming soon, or at least in a couple of years. They really need to reinvigorate and reinvent the engine, because you can definitely still see all of the core elements from that original engine are still present, they're still there, and they've rewritten, they've enhanced, they've added, they've iterated on that engine. But I think now it's time to make a next generation version, and this game can feel dated in some key areas. Certainly the AI is nowhere near as good as it needs to be, and you can have some silly moments where people don't react to you and they take ages to realize you just murdered somebody, and then they turn around and shoot you, and that kind of stands out more now because there's more characters and you expect better interaction with the world. So I'm hoping that these are the areas that IO Interactive will push forward in the next generation, when they can leave behind those Jaguar CPUs, they can dedicate it to a next generation and PC levels and really push forward on trying to use that hardware to give us an even better sandbox environment, and maybe the perfect James Bond title since GoldenEye landed on the N64 all those years ago. Anyway, I know this was slightly longer, and I know this was slightly more in-depth in terms of what covering and how I went through each of the versions. So please let me know your feedback on this. Do you like this mixture of retro and new? Is it too long? Do I want to shorten this down on these pickup ones and just make them dedicated to the actual performance levels and not as much history and information? All that feedback really helps, because this was kind of one of those videos where I made the video and then just talked over it. So a lot of this footage was already there. I just hadn't put together, edited it into a final piece. But hopefully it was beneficial and you still gained some new nuggets of information across all the versions and the history of that Hitman title. Anyway, I'm out, but if you do like this or anything else that I've put together, then please like, share and subscribe, because all of that really helps, and stick a comment below because interacting with the video really helps the hit rate as well. And I'll see you on the next one.
Keep those eyes peeled. Please help!